This particular panel, as noted, will focus on pipeline issues. At least the lead presenter here, Charles Ramos, offers more than a decade of experience in higher education, as well as an enrollment professional consultant. His areas of expertise cover enrollment management, student success initiatives, and academic advising, including data-driven enrollment planning. Previously, and when we first started working together, as I mentioned, the work on this particular forum started formally for me 4 years ago in 2008 when we had a forum. And at that time, Dr. Ramos served at ACT as their specialist for K-12 partnerships, or K-16 partnerships with states like Michigan. And I think at the beginning you had authority for the whole Midwest, and then you went nationally. He also was the director of their outreach services, consulting, and campuses on enrollment, advising, and assessment. Prior to his tenure at ACT, he served at St. Louis University as assistant director of admissions. And you can see from the program that his talk is also based on a chapter in this volume that focuses specifically on ACT's P16 partnerships. And in some ways, a question was asked earlier, with a clear agenda to kind of provide additional opportunity to develop academic merit. Is that fair? The other three panelists are our own local experts. One in the area of outreach and pipeline, one in the area of multiple areas, including retention work, because the Office of Academic Multicultural Initiatives, in addition to having pipeline programs of its own, also plays a very critical role on campus, I think, as a support service academic affairs unit to really improve the way in which students of color especially experience climate on this campus. And then the third one, and I'll talk about them and their in more detail, but I kind of wanted to link their selection to the function. So in addition to the focus on pipeline and retention, the final panelist also is the director of the Comprehensive Studies program here. And I think we have kind of two people. Nick, that was your former job before you moved to the outreach, to develop the outreach center. But we have three panelists here from the University of Michigan who have years and decades of wisdom and expertise around pipeline, retention, achievement gap, and student development work. In the first case, William Nick Collins is currently executive director of the Center for Educational Outreach here at Michigan. From 1992 to 2008, he served as director of U of M's Comprehensive Studies program and adjunct associate professor in psychology. Dr. Collins has previously served as director of the Learning Skills Center at Cornell University, and as the staff psychologist and assistant professor of psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. Next, we have John Matlock, who has a couple of titles here. One as associate vice provost here at Michigan in the provost office, and then secondly as director of the Office of Academic Multicultural Initiatives. As director of OWAMI, Dr. Matlock manages research programs, multicultural activities, pre-college initiatives, student leadership training, and academic enrichment activities. As I mentioned earlier, I think OWAMI has served a very, very critical role here in terms of making this institution a lot more a positive climate for those students of color here. As associate provost, he provides leadership in developing and implementing the multicultural goals of the university and maintains very active relationships with both the Ann Arbor, IPSI, and the Detroit area community in terms of its interface with the University of Michigan. Finally, Margaret Noori, whose PhD is the former director of the Comprehensive Studies program, replaced Nick Collins there, and is also a lecturer in Native American Studies in the Department of American Culture here at Michigan. Her research and creative interests include recovery and maintenance of Native American language and literature, with a very, very strong and special interest in language proficiency and assessment, and the study of indigenous literary aesthetics and rhetoric. So with that introduction, we'll start with Charles Ramos, and then have the other three panelists make commentary.
Obviously, one of the things that we have, the reason I wanted to give some background is just so that everybody's sort of on the same page. In fact, there were some questions that sort of arose before. Steve, you certainly tackled that as I thought that you would, when you were up here, as questions were coming up in terms of some of the differences as it pertains to tests. But when it comes down to it, the ACT is a curriculum-based assessment. And what that means is really, what it's based off of is really what's being taught in the high schools. What the ACT tries to do and does a strong job of is really test students on their levels of proficiency. And those levels of proficiency are in English, math, reading, and science. So obviously the core subject areas for which then we tie directly to post-secondary success, particularly at the first year. And the test itself has been developed by college and high school faculty, experienced in teaching students from a varied cultural and ethnic backgrounds. And so this is certainly not something that's been developed in a vacuum. It's an assessment that has been developed very much so with the assistance of professors and teachers through all levels of education, and gives us the ability, or gives ACT the ability, to be able to really inform those of us who are educators in the work that we do, and not only in terms of effective interventions, but also in the day-to-day work that we have and can do with students as we move them through the funnel and particularly through the K-16 timeline. Basically, item writers are diverse in gender, ethnic background, and geographic location. And then the items are reviewed for sensitivity and fairness, which obviously is a major component, particularly for our discussions today. We've discussed on several fronts, the possibility of fairness, and whether or not there's fairness within the assessment itself. And certainly ACT is very sensitive to that as well, and therefore spends an inordinate amount of time and effort in making sure that the fairness is there. And of course, those items are therefore pre-tested to ensure that fairness. And I mean, in all honesty, in addition to that, and I remember in my days at ACT, one of the things that we consistently did, and I know that ACT does to this day, is really get together advocacy groups that help in consulting, throughout the development of the test itself. And so basically, what we're looking at is advocacy groups representing African American, American Indian, Latino, Asian American, and women, and ensuring that, again, the test in itself is fair, and therefore in its fairness can accurately provide us with the type of data that we need in order to be able to really inform and affect those strategies that are so needed today in our world of education. This is kind of an interesting point because, and again, this is straight from ACT research, is when coursework grades and high school rank are taken into account, race ethnicity is associated with only 1% of the variability in ACT scores. And although some of you may be well aware of this fact, many of you, I'm assuming, are not. And so certainly the variability may not be as great as one may expect, but it also reaffirms the fact that the information that we can collect via the test and really the product of the test, both at the cognitive and non-cognitive level, can certainly assist us in being able to inform how we proceed, particularly with those intervention strategies that I've mentioned. High school grades are not always more predictive of first-year college GPA. In fact, high school GPA is not an effective predictor of success at higher levels of first-year GPA. And what we're talking about there is really 4.0 high school GPA corresponds poorly to the probabilities of success at the 3.25, the 3.5, and the 3.75 GPA levels for first-year post-secondary grade point average at a college or university. And in addition to that, what we really have, what ACT certainly found, and research year in and year out continues to confirm this, is that ACT scores are effective predictors of academic success in college at all levels, but the best predictor, most certainly, is a combination of the ACT and high school GPA. And the accuracy of prediction is very similar across all racial and ethnic lines. And again, I mean, there's a reason why I'm doing this. I want to kind of set a little bit of background in order to be able to, as we move forward and look at the data, understand how then this can really be an impactful tool as we move forward, not only in informing what we do at the post-secondary level, but how we as post-secondary institutions and representatives of those post-secondary institutions can therefore work with our secondary and elementary school friends and colleagues to ensure that we do an effective and impactful job in getting students ready, not when they get here, but before they get here as well. And again, I mean, it's not just a matter of just being able to accept a student. I think so many times what we find is that, that people get caught up really in the whole idea that the test is really for admissions purposes. And the test helps to inform admissions. We've talked, I mean, many people have commented on it, from Ted on to a myriad of others here today, that the test itself is not the puzzle. It's a piece of the puzzle. It helps to inform the experts, being enrollment managers, advising folks, etc. Helps to inform those persons to help make the decisions necessary as it pertains to not only admissions, but also in terms of intervention strategies that come about from advising and student educational services and support services. And so it's not just a tool just to be able to keep in or keep out particular students. I think that unfortunately what ACT and really the testing agencies have been, I guess you can say, a victim of, is that of the fact that it's the whole idea of shooting the messenger. And the messenger is basically just giving us an indication as to the issues that we're dealing with in education as a whole in the country today. What we're seeing is that there is a gap. I mean, that's evident. We all see it. We all understand that. What I think we're seeing is that not only is there a gap as a whole, particularly between what high school or secondary school teachers expect students to know by the time they graduate from high school, and then what post-secondary professors and educators expect students to know as they come in. There's a gap among all students, but that gap is compounded when it comes to students of color and when it comes to our underrepresented student population. And so in what ways can we then use the information to effectively assist our students in placing them in the right courses, and placing them in not only the right courses, but in the right tracks at the post-secondary level and before, to get them back on par in order to be able to have the proficiencies that they need to succeed at the post-secondary level, not just to have access to the post-secondary level. And then high school grades, I mean, obviously, I mean, we need to have other pieces. I mean, as part of a holistic approach, one of the big problems that we see is the fact that over the last few years, the discussion of holistic admissions, let's just say, has really come about because there was a sense and a feel that the process was selective in nature. It was only GPA and college test scores, whether it be ACT or SAT, that really determined a student's admission into an institution. So what did we do? Through that discussion, the holistic push actually was, in many cases, a push towards eliminating the test scores and replacing it with some other factors, which in itself is not holistic. It's still selective, but it's selecting other aspects and other pieces of information to use. Holistic as a whole is truly the use of all data. When we approach our own students and we know that they're involved in some type of research, do we tell them to selectively choose particular pieces of data, or to use all data available that relate to what we're working with? We push for the use of all data and to be able to truly incorporate all of that in order to have an informed opinion and an informed theory as we move forward. Well, the same goes here. We cannot move from one selective approach to another selective approach. When we're talking about holistic, we have to truly be holistic in our admissions criteria. And part of the reason is for this. High school grades and rank are non-standardized evaluations. We know that. And in fact, this is what's very interesting, is that from 1991 to 2003, grade inflation rose by more than 6.5%. And in fact, in the same 12-year time span, ACT average scores rose by less than 1%. So while there was a 6.5% increase in grade inflation, there was only a less than 1% increase in the average ACT score. And in the last 10 years, self-reported GPAs of 4.0 and above rose by over 400%. So, by virtue of that problem, obviously we have to have something to be able to help inform in a standardized manner and in an objective manner what is it that students know. Again, not to keep students in or out of post-secondary education, but more so to inform us as to what is it that we can do in terms of intervention strategies to help those students, but at the same time, in what ways do we also make sure that we're not setting some students up for failure? It is our ethical duty to make sure that if we admit a student to an institution, that we have the ability to at least provide them with a support system necessary for them to succeed. And if we don't have that, to at least guide them in the right direction so that eventually they know that they can still come to the institution once they're able to remediate and really fill in those gaps that unfortunately were really built over the course of years through their elementary and high school education. Post-secondary institutions and ACT, there's really been a misuse of ACT scores for admissions only. It's not just for admissions, it's also to assist in placement and understanding what courses students should take and would benefit them in their continued development and of their proficiency in the core subject areas. It's effective for determining those students who will not be set up for failure, as I mentioned before. Retention and persistence. If we can effectively work with students, understanding their both from the cognitive information and data, which I'll touch on here in a little bit, and the non-cognitive, we have the ability to be able to really use that data to inform retention strategies and in being able to better serve the students and in being able to use that data to help those students both in course placement and also in their overall development at the institution. Obviously, this is going to have some positive impact as we look at retention and persistence. And again, it's just one piece of the puzzle. It's part of a holistic admissions process. So a holistic longitudinal system. And this is really where it comes in as it pertains to the use of the ACT data, both cognitive and non-cognitive, in a holistic manner, but as part of taking advantage of the longitudinal system for which it is. We've talked a lot today about how is it that we can effectively intervene with our underrepresented student population at the post-secondary level. What we haven't talked a lot about today is really taking advantage of all the good work, certainly that we're starting to see here at the University of Michigan, and even other institutions who have really dedicated time and effort and resources towards this. Not only taking advantage of that, but why not also take the data and inform intervention strategies before they get to campus? Why start it when they're freshmen at college? Why not start it before? Why not start it when they're in junior high school? Why not start it as they enter high school? Giving us the opportunity to be able to not only have an impact on those students through their elementary and secondary career, but compounding the benefit of receiving the intervention that they would receive here, for example, starting freshman year. Imagine the compounded effect if they also had that type of intervention as they approached their collegiate career. And that's what we need to be looking at, is how is it that we can effectively touch and communicate and intervene earlier rather than when they set foot on campus. And so ACT has really three particular assessments that really are tied into one: Explore, Plan, and the ACT itself. Explore is actually the assessment given at the 8th and 9th grade level, Plan at the 10th grade level, and the ACT at the 11th and 12th grade level. And they are longitudinal in nature. And so the benefit there is the fact that we can use those assessments on a step-by-step process to not only evaluate student proficiency in the core subject areas, but also to be able to identify key intervention strategies and then track those intervention strategies through time as the student moves from junior high through high school. So with Explore, again, the test tests student proficiency in English, math, reading, and science, and that's on the cognitive side. On the non-cognitive side, what we also are able to collect, in addition to obviously their performance on the test itself, is really the students' perceived needs, academic and other, career interests and interest inventory, students' interests that match career aspirations. Imagine what this information can do at the 8th grade level when a school and when the counselors at a particular school can take that information and effectively start working with students when it comes to career interests, when it comes to guiding them through that process, what courses they're going to need to take because of their interests that they currently have. And it's not just in terms of being able to guide them in the right courses, but also guide them in the right direction as it pertains to college readiness. And that is imperative. And it really begins the process of intervening effectively and strategically right at the beginning of high school, and at the end of junior high and right at the beginning of high school. With PLAN, obviously this test also, being part of the longitudinal assessment piece, also tests the proficiency in English, math, reading, and science. It is a mid-stage assessment, and it really gauges if students are on track. And in this particular case, if a school is using the longitudinal pieces of Explore, PLAN, and the ACT, at this point, what they can do is they can start saying, okay, how have our intervention strategies performed? Are our students who we've been able to intervene with and really started touching at an early stage, are they progressing at a level in which we expect them to progress based off of those strategies? And if not, because of the use of the PLAN test, do we then have the capability, or can we then change course in order to make sure that, since we still have time, that these students prior to high school graduation will have the level of proficiency needed in order to be able to move on, not only to have access to post-secondary education, but to succeed in post-secondary education. On the non-cognitive side, what we also are collecting in terms of information are needs assessment. Students identify specifically what their needs are. High school courses and grades, getting a good understanding at that level as to what they've taken and what they need to take. The UniAct interest inventory. So for those of you obviously familiar with Dr. John Holland's hexagon and the assessment for which the interest inventory that he developed. If any of you look especially at the back of an ACT score report, official score report, you see the World of Works map in the back. Many times when I mention that, some people are like, oh yeah, and some people are like, I have never looked in the back of that sheet at all. But that actually gives you a lot of great information based off of the interest inventory that guides not only post-secondary, but most importantly, secondary educators and counselors, again, in their continued development of a student's understanding as to where they need to be, what they need to do, and how they can get to a point in which they're ready to tackle. Post-secondary education is tied to their career interests and their own individual interests, personal and career-wise. And then there's what's known as Plan EOS. And Plan EOS is really the first point of direct contact, I guess probably the best way to say it. It's the first point of direct contact with the pipeline that connects student to post-secondary institution. And so what I mean by that is the fact that students have the ability to share their names and addresses through the PLAN test with post-secondary institutions, who then purchase those names and start communicating with those students about college and about the post-secondary experience and about how they need to be preparing. So not only are they getting it from the secondary side, if we can effectively use that data to inform and affect intervention strategies, but now they're also getting informed at from the post-secondary level about application process, what the next steps are, etc. With the ACT, again, same as always, it's the English, math, reading, science, in which testing proficiency in those areas, but also it's a final glimpse of proficiency for last-minute interventions. And so this gives sort of that last-minute opportunity for those juniors and seniors who are taking the ACT to be able to say, okay, based off of our interventions over the course of the last few years, where are we now, and what are some last-minute changes that we need to make in order to make sure that you are college ready, that you are ready to succeed in that as you enter post-secondary education. On the non-cognitive side, the ability there is to be able to use a student profile, educational and vocational aspirations, again, continued stepping stone approaches towards career guidance and towards educational guidance and counseling, as well as academic and non-academic accomplishments, needs, activities, and future plans. In fact, one of the things that I keep on telling post-secondary institutions is, do you realize the fact that the score report that you get when a student sends you an official score report has over 350 points of data on it, and of which most institutions only use about 40. And those tend to be solely the scores and the personal information about the student. The rest of the information is all this information as it pertains to educational and vocational aspirations, as it pertains to academic and non-academic accomplishments and needs. The students identify those needs that they have. Some that will state that they have needs in math, needs in terms of getting assistance in math or study skills or whatever it may be. And these are these red flags for which then not only do secondary educators have an ability to then hone in on that, but then on the post-secondary side, advising and admissions can use that information to be able to understand the student at a better level and make sure that that student is already being served before they've even shown up on campus, and have the support mechanisms in place in order to be able to support them. And again, you have EOS, which again is the ability for colleges and universities to purchase those names. The college readiness benchmarks and college readiness standards. Here's where I think that we have an ability to be able to really connect the cognitive with college readiness. And that's because the college readiness benchmarks are empirically derived. They are benchmark scores for all three tests, Explore, Plan, and the ACT, and they indicate student probability for success in the core subject areas for entry-level post-secondary credit-bearing courses. And so what they basically indicate is if you meet or exceed these benchmark scores, you have a 50% chance of getting a B or higher in that particular credit-bearing course at the post-secondary level, entry-level credit-bearing course in the post-secondary level, and a 75% chance of receiving a C or better in that course. And then with the college readiness standards, those standards are actually narratives of the proficiencies that students have based off of the scores that they receive on each of the tests, on Explore, Plan, and the ACT. So why is that important? Because you as an educator, whether it be at the secondary or post-secondary level, have now the opportunity to be able to say, this student has a particular score. How does that translate in a narrative as to what their proficiencies are in English, math, reading, and science? And then based off of that knowledge, in what you can be much more specific as to the interventions that you make and you really put in place for that student in order to help them get to a certain point for success. And in fact, I've added the website on there in which you can get those standards. But what are those college readiness benchmarks? Well, for Explore, Plan, and the ACT, they're as follows. You can see for English, 13 on Explore, 15 on Plan, and 18 on the ACT. Again, because they're longitudinal, we can follow through and be able to really gauge where students are. Same in math, 17, 19, and a 22. Reading, 15, 17, and a 21. And science, 20, 21, and a 24. Again, over the course of a high school career. And what are those credit-bearing courses that correspond? English Comp for English, college algebra for math, so the social sciences for reading, and biology for freshman biology for science. Now, you're probably thinking, well, wait a minute, how does this then tie into the college readiness standards? The way it ties into it is then as an educator, again, either the secondary or post-secondary level, you can gauge where the student has scored in a particular test. Let's say on the ACT, they get a 19 on math. Well, if you go to the college readiness standards, identify what the narratives are for the post-secondary or for the student's proficiency in math, you can then say, okay, I know that math is, the benchmark is a 22, the student has a 19. As you fold both together, you start to see what proficiencies in the narrative are missing. And that is how you target directly what it is that you need to work with that student in that particular subject area. And then just really quickly, one of the things that I wanted to show here is how our students, and this is included in the chapter, how are students performing as a whole based off of these benchmarks? Because that's part of the issue. And this is nationally. If we look at a national scale, in 2008, and the new numbers are out right now, I just wanted to make sure that it was consistent with what the chapter had. But in 2008, the data that I used for the chapter, what we were able to identify is that only 68% met or exceeded the English benchmarks, total. 43% met or exceeded the math benchmarks, 53% met or exceeded the reading benchmarks, and nationally only 28% met or exceeded the science benchmarks. And in fact, 22% met and exceeded all four. For all intents and purposes, only 22% of students nationally in 2008 were really, truly college ready across the board. And if we want to look at just a couple of points, when we look at race and ethnicity, African American students in English, only 37% met or exceeded. American Indian and Alaska Native, 52%. Hispanic, 49%. And the numbers are far less when you look at math, at 11% African American students meeting or exceeding, 25% American Indian, Alaska Native, and 26% Hispanic. 21% of African American students, 40% of American Indian, and 35% of Hispanic students or Latino students met or exceeded the reading benchmark scores. And then when it comes to science, only 5% of African American students, 16% of American Indian, and 13% of Hispanic met or exceeded the science benchmark scores. So it gives us indication as to basically where things stand, but it also gives us the roadmap as to how in the world we can work with our students, not only while they're here, but even more importantly in terms of being able to have an informed and effective process as we intervene with them at the secondary level, making sure that they're ready once they come, not ready after they've already here. I mean, we need to make sure that we give them that opportunity. One final quick point is the fact that testing behaviors really play a gigantic role in this process. Remember I told you about the fact that both when a student takes the PLAN test and the ACT test, they have the ability to be able to share their names with post-secondary institutions? Well, that gets them in the pipeline. And getting them into the pipeline, that act in itself already gives them much more information than they would have had otherwise. Here's the problem. The problem is that for the ACT, African American students and Hispanic students or Latino students take their first ACT as seniors. As you can see here, junior testing, it's the white student who's taking the test predominantly for the first time as juniors, not seniors. But yet, African American students and Latino students, it's about 40% that are taking it as juniors and 60% that are taking it as seniors. Why does that matter? Because guess what? Post-secondary institutions will buy names of students in their junior year and maybe the summer before senior year. Once senior year hits, post-secondary institutions are no longer interested in increasing their pool of students that they're working with. They're interested in converting and yielding those students. So by the time that African American students and Latino students or Hispanic students are getting into the pipeline, the institutions as a whole are no longer looking at expanding that pool. And if you're not looking at expanding that pool, who's not getting informed about the post-secondary process? Who's not getting informed about scholarships? Who's not getting informed about financial aid? Who's not getting informed about anything to do with higher education? This exact population that we're trying to make sure we're giving greater access to. So in a sense, their testing behavior is directly impacting access. So let alone the fact that we need to be able to intervene at a greater level and at a more impactful level, but at the same time, what we have to be able to do is also inform our African American students and our Hispanic and Latino students that timing of testing is not only great because it gives them an opportunity to be able to inform their educators as to what interventions will work and to do so in an earlier time frame, but also to be able to share that information so they can enter the pipeline in a timely fashion so that they and their families are more informed about how the process works. Therefore, in and of itself, will give them a greater opportunity to be able to have access to post-secondary education in the first place. And these numbers just show it. Juniors test, students not test, or juniors not purchased, total 52,000 across all the score ranges. Look what happens for those who were seniors first, who were seniors who took their first test as seniors. Almost triple the amount not purchased. And it didn't matter what score range. Look at the score, look from a 20 up to a 36. That's a significant number, not even purchased by any institution. Not by 1 or 2 or 3, there were, in all honesty, about 40,000 students who never, ever had their name purchased. Therefore, they were never proactively communicated to by post-secondary institutions. Why? Because they took their first ACT as a senior. K-16 approach, overall, we need to encourage students to take the ACT in junior year, not just because of the fact that it's a way to be able to pay ACT some extra money, or not it's just because of the fact that we're using the test to be able to admit students. It's the fact that we're wanting to be able to get educators both at the post-secondary and secondary levels to use that data to actually make informed and effective intervention strategies, let alone getting students into the pipeline. Use longitudinal assessments to inform and affect those intervention strategies. Ensure that students release their information for post-secondary access, again, through the EOS programs, and encourage students to send official score reports. Secondary strategies, use the ACT non-cognitive and cognitive data to inform intervention, guidance, and course placement and college career strategies, readiness strategies. So many times these tests are taken, and guess what happens? The test results get filed, and that's it. No wonder people don't see the value in that, because it's used completely in the wrong manner. It's used solely, it seems solely as an admissions tool rather than actually an intervention tool. And then on the post-secondary side, we need to be able to get post-secondary educators and post-secondary institutions to become more involved in the process. We have to create a more seamless P16 or K through 16 process and system, so that what we can do is not only inform, but as a whole unit of education rather than separate silos, a whole unit of education, really guide our students as a whole. Not just even, I mean, really this is an issue that is throughout all areas and race and ethnicities, but in particular within our African American and Latino populations. If we are able to build a seamless process and maybe have our post-secondary side lead that, and really go out and do effective high school outreach, that can make a gigantic difference as it pertains to getting greater access and success for our underrepresented students.
Our challenge today has been to consider how colleges and universities might go about maintaining a diverse student body. That challenge involves responding to anti-affirmative action policies. It means dealing with widespread disparities in test scores. And it means defining or redefining merit in a broad sense. Charles spent a good deal of time focusing on test scores, in particular ACT. And so I feel the need to deviate a little bit and make some comments about test in general, at least to share my views on it. I think some of them will be in accord with what Charles has said, and some maybe not so much. But hopefully this may contribute to stirring the pot a little bit and make for a better discussion as the day moves on. Test scores are useful and informative in my opinion, but not definitive. And I think one of the problems that's happened with our college admissions process around the country over the course of several decades has been, simply put, to overemphasize tests and test scores. It is to view them as definitive. If you know the test score, then you have the one-size-fits-all dimension that allows for decisions to be made as to who should go to college and who should not. The problem, of course, is that test scores, even when combined with high school grade point average, together do not account for a great deal of the variance in college achievement, that is GPA. It's very clear that a wide variety of other factors are involved in a student's adjustment to college, acclimation to the institution. These may include test-taking behaviors, study skills behaviors, such as the kinds of things that may be done in the comprehensive studies program. mentoring activities such as the kinds of things done in the Office of Academic Multicultural Initiatives. In other words, it's very clear that a wide variety of things help students to become acclimated, adjusted to, and successful in college. And it seems to me that that kind of information is the kind of thing we want our admissions offices around the nation to consider. The problem, of course, is only a problem at selective institutions, as has been pointed out earlier. The vast majority of colleges and universities around the country don't really have to rely upon test scores to build an entering class. We had a meeting with colleagues from around the country last year, and I was surprised to discover that not just the University of Oklahoma, for example, but the University of Nebraska, if you graduate from an accredited high school in Nebraska, you're admissible to the University of Nebraska. That's very different from the kind of thing that takes place at the University of Michigan, at Ivy League schools, and at other selective institutions. So what I'm saying is that context matters. It matters for the students, and it matters for the institutions, and I think it's important for admissions officers to take that context into consideration. Now, that context may include family background, it may include such things as school quality, and I think importantly, it can concern such things as the fit between an individual student and that student's goals and aspirations and what that particular college has to offer. One of the ways we try to address the question of fit is through our outreach activities here at the University of Michigan. And certainly that is something my office is concerned with doing, but I want to stress it's not just my office at the University of Michigan. We have over 300 programs and activities that qualify as educational outreach activities run by colleges, schools, programs, and over 70 educational outreach programs by student groups. Our students likewise are concerned with this issue. You've heard about programs offered through the medical school, but our School of Dentistry also offers outreach programs. Our engineering school offers M-Zone in Detroit, in an urban area in our region. We have the Intergroup Relations program that reaches out to students all over our state. And of course, importantly and fundamentally, our Office of Admissions is involved in outreach programs. What I mean by outreach is engagement with communities for the purpose of identifying, developing talent, and attracting a diverse student body to our institution. And we do that in a wide variety of ways at Michigan. The first thing I think we try to do is to place the University of Michigan and selective colleges in general on the radar screen for the select populations, target groups around the state. Now, this is important for a variety of reasons, but I want to emphasize one in particular. For a lot of the students we want to reach, and let me be clear, who are the students we want to reach? We want to reach first-generation college students, those whose parents have not gone to college. We want to reach low-income students, and we want to reach underrepresented minority students. Why? If you think about the leading organizations and individuals in our country for the last few years, they've been talking about things like our global competitiveness, college readiness, for example, and the need to increase the numbers of college-educated people in the United States in order to have the workforce we want, the workforce we need for the future. So whether we're talking about President Obama's call, or the Lumina Foundation's call, or the College Board's call, or the National Association of Governors' call, they're all calling for us as a nation to increase the numbers of people who earn high-quality college degrees. The simple fact of the matter is, I used this expression before, unless we reach out for first-generation college students, low-income students, and underrepresented minority students, we can't get there from here. We have got to have those students involved in the process, early on, at the point of testing, at the point of applying, and certainly the point of entering colleges and universities. So among the things we want to do, I'm back to my point now about making sure that the University of Michigan and selective colleges are on the radar screen, because the students we want to reach don't always make much of a distinction between kinds of colleges. Research universities like the University of Michigan, liberal arts colleges like Albion College, Oakland Community College. For many of our first-generation low-income and underrepresented minority students, college is college, and they're not making a lot of distinctions between those places. We, in higher education, know there are enormous differences in those levels of college education. So we need to do things to make sure that students and their parents are aware of those distinctions. And not only that, but what the requirements are. What's required for being admitted to the University of Michigan? Certainly there are courses to be taken, but as Charles has pointed out, maybe another thing you want to do is take the ACT your junior year instead of waiting for senior year. I think it begs the question, why do those students delay taking the test? That's one we might want to come back to. But we want to do things to make sure that selective colleges and what's required to get to selective colleges is on the radar screen for the students we want to attract. We want to encourage students to meet those requirements. We want to give students exposure to our campus in a very real and tangible way. And so among the things that the various offices at U of M do is to sponsor campus visits of a wide sort, but not simply in a one-way street kind of activity. That is, bring a busload of students up for a couple of hours and then send them home. As I look around this room, I'm impressed by the number of people who are here who have participated in something our office has offered for the last couple of years called Wolverine Express. And this activity is when we get a busload of University of Michigan faculty and staff and take them into a particular high school. There, they engage with students and with teachers and with counselors, and they talk about research, they talk about their careers, they talk about their lives, they talk about requirements in their discipline. They make connections with students so that the students can make connections between what they're doing at that point, 9th, 10th, 11th grade in high school, and what's needed for them to go on to college. We think that kind of activity is important. That is, it's important for students to have meaningful interactions with faculty and staff here on our campus. Another thing is to make sure that we're doing what we can to provide interactions between students in schools around our state and students who are already here at the University of Michigan. They are, in fact, the best role models one could have. Some of them serve as mentors, some of them serve as tutors, many of them are volunteering in schools around our state. And we think it's useful to do just that, and we want to continue doing that as well. Many of our students we want to reach are aware that college generally is a positive thing. But we've encountered, as we talk to people around the state, students and parents, objections. You heard one of them expressed earlier today. I can't remember which of our speakers said it, but some of our students will say something like, well, I know someone who went to college and got a college degree and they don't have a job. Well, we live in an anomalous period right now. We've gone through the Great Recession. There's some indications that we may be coming out of it, I guess, or have emerged from it as a nation. But that places a real challenge on the shoulders of college students, recent graduates, and those contemplating going to college when they look at the cost of going to college and the debts they may incur as a result of 4 years of education. So we are also trying to emphasize to students things that really underscore the value of college in a broad sense. So certainly there is the income advantage. Parents and students seem to be aware that going to college generally makes you or puts you in a better position as far as income is concerned. But we've also been emphasizing the kinds of things that have been identified by Sandra Baum and others at the College Board. Not just increased income, but, for example, better job security, better health, largely because college graduates work in places that provide health care insurance. But also because college graduates tend to exercise more, refrain from smoking, and other excesses, I might say. Some college students do. Some college graduates, some don't. I know a few who don't, but. The College Board also includes stronger communities in terms of the advantages. That is, those who graduate college tend to live, first of all, in integrated communities. They tend to be involved in community organizations and activities, that is volunteer. They tend to write to their congressmen and senators. They tend to vote in elections. And finally, the College Board has emphasized that another value of college is closer families. And when we visit students in our schools and we talk to them about college graduates having closer family life, some of that has to do with the hours that people work. Some of it has to do with the flexibility in schedule. Some of it has to do with paid vacation and so forth. But it's one of the things that seems to impress our students. So when we talk about pipeline and reaching out to students around the state, our goal as an outreach center and many of the activities we are engaged in doing are to try to emphasize those kinds of points so that students are familiar with what's required to go to college and that they in fact take the appropriate steps to prepare themselves and be admitted and be successful.
Let me just take a different perspective, and that is to frame a lot of this within diversity. You've heard a lot about access, you've heard a lot about meritocracy, and let me try to put it together in some cases from a University of Michigan perspective, but it's also based on years of research, years of practice, and years of working with other institutions around the country in terms of how folks are making different definitions. I think Nick mentioned a context, and I think it's important that from the University of Michigan, there was a context back in 1989 with student protest. And from that emerged, so diversity didn't just drop out of the sky, as some people would have you believe. It was the result of student activism. It is easy to start thinking about diversity when students are occupying the president's office. And out of that emerged the Michigan mandate. And we build on that Michigan mandate, which was the university's strategic diversity plan. One thing that became very, very key when this case went to court was the title was the Michigan Mandate Strategic Linking of Diversity and Academic Excellence. That really was very important because what it did was tie diversity to one of the three institutional missions. And it tied it to, in this case, to the academic mission. It was not sitting out there by itself. And there's so many institutions you see diversity is easy to pick off because it's not part of the institution mission, it's just out there by itself. We had to do some things different after Prop 2 because even though we could use race as a consideration, Prop 2 essentially said you couldn't. So what you see is a number of programs that have gone through an evolution. The one thing that I'm very proud of, I almost feel like I'm putting on my alumni hat, is that over the past couple of years, a number of diversity programs have celebrated their 40th year, 25th year. my office celebrates tomorrow with a symposium its 25th year. And what it suggests is that there's been a tremendous commitment to sustaining these programs, enhancing these programs, even through troubled times. When Prop 2 passed, someone from the General Counsel's office and someone from the Provost's office went to every academic unit to look at all of the activities, all of the programs, the scholarships, and the goal was to enhance those programs so that we didn't lose them under Prop 2. And so, for example, scholarships. We learned from our friends at University of Washington the grandfathering the scholarships. So all the minority scholarships and the women's scholarships we grandfathered in so that we didn't eliminate those programs. And so that became extremely important, is to maintain the academic mission when we looked at these programs, to make sure we just weren't eliminating programs for the sake. And so that's why we have, Michigan as an institution has eliminated very few programs and activities related to diversity. In fact, we keep adding them. Nick's program is fairly new. Phil's program is fairly new. So we've always figured out a way to not only keep what we have, but to expand and enhance. And sometimes with some tweaking. A good example of this is the School of Public Health, where they had a program that brought in second and third year undergraduate students, and it was for minorities. So what they did was to tweak it after Prop 2, and they put a clause in that we would consider anybody that had a demonstrated commitment to urban public health. And so with 25 students, they would get probably about 5 white students. But these students would have to demonstrate that they were committed to urban health, public health, and they were willing to work as part of their internship in hospitals. When Prop 2 went down, one of the things we did was have a gathering of our friends who had already experienced this. So we had a 3-day campus meeting with administrators here, with folks from University of Washington, from UCLA, UC Berkeley, and University of Texas, to talk about some of the strategies that they had picked up. And we were able to incorporate a number of those. We also learned that you can't use, you have to be careful about proxies. And we're always trying, as we struggle through this whole diversity piece, is try to figure out ways to come up with proxies for diversity, and particularly for race and ethnicity. In many cases, it just doesn't work. It will not get you there. One of our colleague schools learned that they decided to use social economics as a proxy for race. Well, it turned out that most of their minority students were not low social economics, and so they lost all those students to private institutions that were not covered under affirmative action. So you have to really be careful about how one goes about this. I also think it's important that we have to be careful about shifting demographics. The demographics have really changed. Even at the University of Michigan, for example, in our research, we find that more of our African American students are coming from suburban communities and not urban institutions as they were for, say, 20 years ago. It gives you a very different type of student that has to be recruited differently, has to be dealt with differently when he or she gets to the institution. Often cases not having a super commitment to affirmative action. I think it's also important that, and we've done a very good job of this, is to look at to realize that diversity can't be a code word for assimilation. That is, come to our institution, the quicker you figure out how you fit in, the better off you will be. We, in our research, look at what's the institutional impact in terms of diversity. If you're going to increase your diversity number, you ought to be a different institution. And we also pay a lot of attention to what I call the intergroup experience. So we have great intergroup programs, and they work very well, but we also focus on intergroup experience because sometimes the differences are greater within a particular group than they are between groups. And you have to have the programs, the activity, and the respect. You cannot send the word that the quicker you leave Detroit in Detroit, you'll be okay. Because students come exploring those differences. So for example, an African American student, tremendous gender differences, differences in-state, out-state, differences, did you go to a suburban school or an urban school? And students have to work through it, and there are also socioeconomic differences. So students have to work through those differences. In the case of retention, it is very important, how do you define retention? Do you want to retain your students for 6 years, which is the number that most folks use when they give the retention figures? I think it's important to look at satisfaction as a measure of retention. How satisfied are people when they, at the end of the process? What type of jobs do they get? And so that's important. Also, what happens on a year-to-year basis? There are some institutions we work with that lose 30% of their first-year students at the end of the first year. And that has, so essentially at that point, access is a revolving door for those students. So we have to look at all of those considerations. We do celebrations. We do ethnic celebrations for graduation. They're not proxies for commencement, but they're special celebrations, special recognition. And one thing it does, for example, Black Celebratory, which is done after all the commencement, we draw 2,000 people to that. And if you're talking about critical mass, that critical mass is extremely important. I also think it's important that one of the things I've always said when we define diversity, diversity is not happy talk, happy meals, happy feet, and happy students. And oftentimes that's just exactly how it's defined at many institutions. So you end up with articulate students who get lots of food and they learn to socialize and dance very well with the holding hands. That is not diversity. We have to look at diversity from this perspective of how it impacts the institution. Another thing that's very important, and we've been very blessed here, is the impact of leadership and long-standing leadership. Is the leadership giving one message to alumni in suburban communities and another one to alumni in Detroit? And those mixed messages, at very critical points in Michigan, we were able to go out and give that message to the business community, to the military people, which resulted in the 500 amicus briefs that were filed in support of the University of Michigan. Let me mention a final point. I think it's important for institutions to tackle the myths that exist around diversity. Sometimes we don't challenge myths at our institutions, and so you have white students believing, for example, that all the financial aid money goes to students of color, particularly African American, Latino, when that even triggered a federal investigation to the General Accounting Office, found that it was a very small percent. You're talking about 4 or 5%. The truth of it is 70% of our students get some type of aid. Another one is the whole issue of self-segregation, that when minority students get together, we look at that as something wrong, and we never ask what's everybody else doing. And as our numbers got bigger, one of the things that strikes me in the research is that students, the bigger the numbers, the more diverse the students get. And what I'm saying is that when I was a student here, we had maybe, for African American student groups, we had maybe 8 groups. We now have 50, and they're competing against each other. The politics are very different. How they express themselves become very, very different. Michigan has 1,200 student organizations that you can join, and if you don't like any of them, you just get a petition and 4 or 5 people and you start your own group. And so we have to recognize the importance of student organization, how that fits into the culture that we have here. A final comment for me is that diversity is here to stay. And some folks have not figured that out. And you can't have these proxies. You have to be very careful when you ask folks, how are you defining diversity? I've been to schools where, we're a very diverse institution. You find that they have loaded their diversity with international students. There's nothing wrong with that. They've loaded with out-of-state students in some cases, a state institution. So one thing that we've been very fortunate, we have places for all of those different definitions of diversity. But from a public perspective, when you ask people if they support diversity, you get about a 90% agreement. When you ask them if they support racial diversity, that number drops down to about 25%. So we have to be very careful how we're defining our diversity, and also that we're meeting the needs of the different components of diversity, because the one thing diversity can do, if you don't handle it right, it can blow up in a classroom, and it can definitely create a lot of division. It's not going away, and at some point it's going to become a national security problem. You cannot focus your energies in terms of excluding people from education at a time that we should be trying to get as many people educated as possible. So when you talk about expanding the pool, you get labeled with being elitist and things like that. We can't afford to do that as a nation. That's why the military got into the lawsuits that went to the Supreme Court in a very, very big ways, because they recognize that. Thank you.
From the perspective of some of the ways that I interface with the other groups on campus and things that we do that are similar across the country, we have pipeline retention and development, those same issues. I guess the advantage of you having put a Native American person in this position is that I might look at them differently. One thing that I often do is think about pipeline, which, you know, when you look at that word, what that is sort of a high-speed linear transfer of some kind of asset. Well, if we take that apart and we look instead at how do we create something sustainable, I think those, for me, are the programs that I like working on. When we are creating a sustainable partnership with communities so that we are having ongoing cooperation with the communities that we wish to have represented on our campus, and there's many programs like that. When Nick said that over 370 different groups reach out across campus, what I hope is that we're looking at each one of those and saying, is it sustainable? Was it a one-time thing, or is it something that's going to happen again and again? Is it something that the students and parents in that community can trust as a real partnership, or was it just something that someone did once? I think that idea of sustainability in any kind of pipeline program is really, really essential. In terms of retention, the thing that I might try to add there is we try to really work both sides of the coin on that. So when people come to us, we run the Bridge program, which has 250 students that come through admissions, and we try to give them everything that we can to get them ready for the campus that they're going to be competing in. And through, instruction, advising, tutoring, the summer programs that we have, we do our best, but we also have really tried to reach out to every single department so that diversity doesn't mean that I'm going to fix it in the summer bridge program. Diversity means I'm asking the Romance Languages department to think about the type of Spanish they teach. Are we really open to the fact that the Latino students who come here speak a Spanish that we don't teach on this campus? Are we challenging our faculty with these questions of diversity that get at the core of their discipline? Because if we're not doing that, then diversity is just what John was talking about, it's just assimilation. And that's not what we want to do. We want to bring people here that will think differently, that will grow to be strong leaders, and then actually make a difference in the disciplines on campus so that as I'm teaching Ojibwe, I'm teaching ways of understanding the lakes in a different way. I'm teaching people to think in an indigenous methodology that's still relevant in this contemporary science, I guess, that we teach now. In terms of development, I think that's another thing that I would echo some of the things other people here have said, that you really have to look at what the students need. And that when these students are here, over and over, what I see is that these students develop our faculty, our majority students, our campus as a whole, as much as we might be trying to develop them. And we can't forget that because it's work. When we watched just a few students put on the 40th annual powwow, what those students did for the community was develop our entire community to have a certain awareness about diversity. Through their leadership, they did that. And so certainly I want to develop those students, and that's my responsibility on campus, but I also have to really help my faculty peers and the staff on campus be aware that they come and they develop us. They teach us ways of thinking and being in the world that if we didn't actually live and actively support diversity, we wouldn't be exposed to these type of things. Mindful of the time, I might try to keep it kind of short, but I think that really, like I said, the ways that we can connect, the fact that we're looking at these issues, the fact that we're willing to go beyond test scores and really see how we can make a difference is what's important. I mean, we all come with different stories. I mean, like I said, that little quote at the beginning would come from African American, Hindu and Christian Jewish kind of communities, but then I also come from a community where the stories are things like, you should stand and look to the east and celebrate the dawn, don't stand to the west and fear the darkness. And those kind of lessons, all the different lessons that we bring are why we should have diversity. So, hopefully we'll see all of you in the breakout sessions, and if not, when we are walking around the campus trying to make a difference.
Comments or questions?
For the ACT, you mentioned that it's primarily students of color, African American and Latino students who are deciding to take the ACT in their senior year as opposed to their junior year, and that's serving as a barrier for their own college access. I'm wondering if you can speak more specifically about how that data was organized. And I'm speaking from a position of college advising.
Sure.
One of the primary issues that I faced with students having issues surrounding the ACT and college access is the actual cost of the ACT. So for us in the state of Michigan, it is sort of a state mandate that you must take the ACT in order to graduate. So as a member of an inner city school, I've noticed that predominantly, or mostly all of my students within this particular high school, and I've also noticed with other college advisors, and there are about 15 of us spread out throughout the state of Michigan, our students take it their junior year.
Right.
And then they retake it their senior year, and that becomes dire if their ACT scores are low. And so the barrier there has been that the ACT score is almost $50 plus writing, and it costs about $10 to send the actual scores to colleges and universities. And there's definitely an option to, list the 4 colleges that they may want to attend and have those scores sent there. But in terms of fit, and also in terms of students having access to a variety of colleges to determine what schools will actually suit their needs, they may actually need to send those ACT scores out to more institutions. So that was my first question. It's just sort of how that information is sort of organized.
Sure. Well, first of all, in terms of the collection of that information, basically, obviously, within the registration component of the ACT, ACT collects race and ethnicity information. And so what was able to be done by our researchers at ACT was be able to determine, okay, well, based off of what race and ethnicity that was self-reported on the ACT registration packet, they were basically able to then connect that to when they first took the ACT. What was the first instance of their taking the ACT? And it was identified that within different groups there were different entry points in terms of taking the ACT. And so what was interesting there is that, and unfortunate, is that what was identified through that through that analysis is that it was very evident that African American and Hispanic students were taking the ACT at a much later point in time. Obviously here in Michigan it's a little different. You have what's called census testing, which the state pays for the students to take the ACT junior year. Certainly I think that cost can certainly be an issue, there's no doubt about it. At the same time, I know that there's also alternatives and opportunities for students who are unable to afford to take the test, both for ACT and even for College Board, to be able to get that waived. It's just a matter of being able to approach the testing agencies and asking for that waiver. So I think that barrier is one that we just need to inform students of their ability to be able to get that waiver. And of course the benefits of students here in the state of Michigan, like there are in some other states in which the states pay for the test for junior year, is not only do the students get into the pipeline earlier, but it's at no cost to them. It's covered by the state itself. And that's a huge advantage, one, in being able to take the test, two, in terms of helping to inform the high schools as to last-minute interventions, possibly, to be able to really touch on those areas where students may lack proficiency in the core subject areas. At the same time, being able to look at the non-cognitive information that's also collected and helping and guiding those students late junior year and into their senior year. And of course, what we talked about before, their ability to be able to have their names accessed by post-secondary institutions. You'd ask the question about whether or not, obviously they get 4 free institutions that they can send the official score reports to, but realize that through EOS, when a student takes the ACT, their names are available to any and all institutions for which that student would fit what that institution is looking for. So if an institution, which most institutions are interested in increasing diversity, if an institution selects particular groups and underrepresented groups, then those names will become available whether or not the student indicated that a particular and specific institution. So now the level of information that institution gets is just name and address rather than full information on the score report, but it still gives them a level of access that they wouldn't have had otherwise.
I wanted to follow up with you a little bit about that. Now that ACT is aware that you have this population that takes it so late, what are you doing as an institution to sort of shape that and maybe move that needle with us?
Well, I mean, I'm no longer with ACT, but I know that when I was there, we were working with post-secondary institutions at all levels, including I was in charge of planning a meeting on an annual basis with all the enrollment managers from the Big Ten. And I see Ted shaking his head, yep. And we talked about this, and we talked about the fact that what we needed to do on a national level is to be able to promote at the secondary level also, and having post-secondary push for this, is for testing earlier in the student's career, meaning the junior year. Obviously, on a different page, we were also trying to promote, and many post-secondary institutions assisted in having this occur at statewide levels. In Illinois, for example, even here in Michigan, was to be able to get students tested, paid for by the state, not only with ACT, but in other areas using Explore and Plan, so that you did have that longitudinal that ability for us to be able to look at students longitudinally and then intervene throughout. Again, not just using the cognitive scores and whatnot, but also the non-cognitive information to help inform guidance and counseling. And so anyway, there was definitely an effort on our behalf at ACT to reach out, the example being the Big Ten, but we did this in many other areas, to reach out to post-secondary institutions and entities to push on their level, let alone having ourselves pushing secondary institutions to promote to their students earlier testing.
I think we all agree that we have in the university a compelling interest for diversity in order for the university to thrive. And we need to get those through excellent pipeline programs, which some of you have outlined and which I participate in myself. But I have a different question for you, and I hope you'll forgive me and have some patience with this question. We have a coordinated attack in this state and many other states around the country on K-12 public education. And an example of that attack might be the defunding of public education and then the raising of standards. The raising of standards is good, we defund them, and then in Michigan, if you set up that failure, especially if you're in an urban school district, you get an emergency manager who takes over your district. So a lot of what the information that those longitudinal tests that you're describing gives you power to do, you're unable to do because you don't have funding or processes in place to do it. So what can higher education do on a bigger scale to influence that problem and that attack on public education? Not just the pipeline programs, which I think are great, but what can we do politically to influence the attack on K-12 that is influencing whether our universities can thrive with diversity? Thank you.
I mean, I know that at least as it pertains to having the data available to inform and affect intervention strategies, but the inability to be able to do that due to resources that are limited or being taken away, I think that in that particular case, obviously this is not an issue that's just specific to Michigan. It's an issue that we see throughout the country, and in many cases where the efforts have been successful, there has certainly been a coordinated effort between ACT and the post-secondary side to be able to really push politically at the state level the reasoning behind the needs for improved or increased you can say investment in education as a whole, and the reasoning behind it, especially if the state is willing, like Michigan, to put forth quite a few resources to test every single student with the assessment. We have to give the reasoning behind why is it that, what do we do now? You can't just give a test for the sake of just giving a test. You have to be able to give a test in order to be able to use the data and the information to inform the strategies that should come from the administration of the test. At the same time, though, I think that whilst we can take advantage of a joint relationship between all aspects of education, P16 and ACT, especially like here in the state of Michigan where ACT is so involved, I think at the same time, as I mentioned in my presentation, there has to really be a continued effort like we see between the University of Michigan and other entities throughout the P16 continuum. But I think there also needs to be even deeper involvement in terms of the understanding of how to be able to use that data to change and to make more effective not only the types of strategies that we put in place, but increasing the rigor in the classroom to be able to give students, at least on the cognitive level, that greater chance of getting the proficiency that they need to be successful as they approach post-secondary education. And I think that we have, when you look at just the University of Michigan by itself, the resources here outside of financial resources, I'm talking about mind power, and I'm talking about the talent that is here on campus. It is tremendous to be able to take those resources and just in itself serve the community just within a 60-mile radius. And imagine if we were able to harness every post-secondary institution in the state to do the same. We would be able to actually do more with less than what we are right now. And that is to complement what is currently being done and the great things that are being done here at the University of Michigan. And again, it's not just about using the test scores and just having the test scores. As I mentioned before, it's an ability to be able to use those scores as the key to be able to unlock what it is that we need to do to help each and every student at the individual level become stronger in the areas that they need to in order to have greater access and probability of success. And it's not using it for admissions purposes, but also it's, I think a lot of times people kind of get also confused in terms of how we use the scores. It's not so much whether or not we should use the scores, we should, but the decision should be where, how do we attribute weight to it? And what type of weight do we attribute to it? That's the question.
And that's really up to each and every expert that's in every institution. The test should not represent or replace the expertise in the room at every level. It should complement the expertise, and it's those experts that move on using that data to help in reaching out to secondary ed, elementary ed, let alone with making the decisions that they need to make here at the campus level.
I think it's a deeper problem than just those of us who are concerned about higher education. I think what we ought to be concerned is that what's creeping through this country has become very obvious in this campaign, is there's a sense of anti-intellectualism that's going on. It's cool to be stupid, and that's what's being conveyed by many of our candidates. That's what's being conveyed by some of our political parties. So, when the president, as I said earlier before, talks about expanding education so that everyone has an opportunity, it's called elitist. And now the question is, we value the whole thing about education. Folks are now saying, you don't need to go to college. And so from a policy perspective, what happens, it represents a shift. A very subtle shift, because when education is viewed as a public good, then it's saying the society has a vested interest in this. When you shift it and say that education is a private good and it only benefits the person getting education, what starts to emerge, and you see it emerging in financial aid policy, what emerges is that since it's a private good that doesn't benefit society, then you ought to pay for it. And so you see that happening in all of our policies. So it's kind of scary when you look at the demographics of the future and they talk about this big shortage of educated people, that you now have this groundswell of folks saying that you don't need education. And so therefore, it makes it very easy to cut education, to increase the burden of student loans on individuals.
If I could just add one quick thing, just because I wanted to make sure to piggyback on what you just said, and is the fact that it is absolutely, when we look at the impact that we can have on education as a whole, particularly from the post-secondary side, as I mentioned before, it is absolutely imperative, because we can then better prepare our students before they even make it on campus. I said how what we've been talking about predominantly is really getting students, once they're here, to be involved in intervention strategies that help them get through and succeed all the way until graduation and beyond. But being able to reach out to them earlier is where really we need to make a difference. And tied to what you just mentioned in terms of even the changing demographics, as we see, everybody knows that the demographics are showing tremendous increases, particularly in the Latino community, but also certainly in the African American community. And apart from the social implications and responsibilities that we have as post-secondary institutions, we also, if we turn it around and just look at it as a business, with a decreasing number of Caucasian students entering higher education because the numbers are just not there anymore, and an ever-increasing number of Latino and African American students, it is absolutely the greatest return of investment for us to go out and proactively work with secondary and elementary educators in terms of being able to do those early interventions, because if we do that, then we have more and more students who are college ready and college bound thinking than what we have today. So many of our students who are African American and Latino who do not see higher education as a viable option, it's not because they don't have the ability, it's the fact that they haven't been given the opportunity. And they haven't been given the opportunity at the level, at the academic level within their elementary schools and high schools. And these students aren't dumb. We've talked about that all day today. These students are not dumb. They just know that they don't have a chance in the world of succeeding at the post-secondary level, and therefore they just never get into it. That's one of the factors that plays a role. And so it is absolutely a tremendous return on investment for us to be able to look ahead, even in a business sense, and say, we need to be able to really get involved at the secondary and elementary level in order to increase the number of college-bound students, because in turn, that gives us the opportunity for future years of continued growth and enrollment, and let alone not only enrollment to the institution, but retention throughout, and what those implications are in terms of our net tuition revenue.